This is just a tutorial and review on how to analyze for the claim of a nonfiction or informational text. In this instance, before leaving for extended spring break, we're reading the essay titled Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is a picture PDF version of the annotations which I had been doing and which I was doing while you guys were also annotating on the first 2 pages of the text, front and back on the first 2 pages of this lengthy text. It's about 21 pages in a printed out way. So what I want to do here is show you how I annotated and describe to you the thought processes, especially as they fit into meeting the expectations of the proficiency scale for analyzing a claim, analyzing an author's claim. There's another scale that's going to be assessed soon, and it is going to be on the one that says evaluate author's purpose and strength of reasoning. In fact, in my model, where I have written an essay version of an analysis of the claim's development in these first 4 pages, I actually incorporated some of these other elements already. I believe many of you are already ready to do this, where you can analyze for author's purpose and strength of reasoning. With Miss Gray, you'll remember that you discussed and learned about faulty reasoning. We call that logical fallacies. And so when you read about and saw some video clips of different examples of logical fallacies, you came to an understanding that sometimes we over-rely on emotion, or sometimes we over-rely on repeating the same lies over and over, and through that repetition, eventually people just give in and break and begin to assume that they were accurate and that they weren't lies at all, but actually facts. False news works that way a lot. And so you notice that there were a bunch of different logical fallacies. All right, well, in this video, my goal is to simply break down my analysis for each of these 5 different elements in the first 4 pages. And there's no way that I can actually go through and discuss all of this text. However, I will give you a gist of how I first came to an understanding what the claim was, and then secondly, how I began to identify different ways that the author was developing that claim through the text. So I read through, and the very first thing I did, by the way, at the end of this document, you'll notice a step-by-step process. This is really a reflection on my own processes based on the proficiency scale, and your processes would probably be very similar. This is what I would probably recommend. Read for a basic understanding. Define challenging words as you go. We did this in class. So, for example, as we started reading, we needed to define the Latin term that starts out in that first sentence. Do not seek outside yourself. Immediately, we have a very similar command, a very similar statement to the one where it says trust thyself, right? Next, once you have defined words such as bantling and words like not and latent and so on, then we can move on to having a greater understanding of what each paragraph is saying. So we're going to read the text to identify key language. Notice the diction that repeats. In this context, I noticed that the word thought, I just began to see recurring words throughout. And so I noticed the word thought is there a lot. Thought, 1, 2, 3, at least on the first page. And then on the second page, 1, 2, 3 more times. So thought is important. Now, you also have the word impression. You also have the words impression again. You have sense and voice of the mind, gleam of light which flashes across the mind, These are all different ways of expressing what exactly a thought is, according to Emerson. And we probably would generally agree with that. The word sentiment is another word for thought also. Other recurring words that are seen early on, or ideas, are the recurring ideas of various authorities. For example, the authorities or the respectable wisdoms of Moses, Plato, and Milton, philosopher, religious leader, and author. You also have bards and sages. And as you continue on, you'll see that God is referenced and the Almighty. However, this author begins to convey what the Almighty is to him. God again. And then he continues on and eventually gets to a discussion of the devil. So, various sources of wisdom or information or positions of respect, that kind of thing, depending on a perspective of who respects, right? All right, so beyond that, let's move on. Paraphrase complex phrasing to get a firmer grasp of what it says. So, firmer grasp of what it says. I'm going to paraphrase. You'll notice a lot of what I put over to the side are my either paraphrases or my reactions to the text. For example, when he says, I read the other day some verses written by an eminent painter, which were original and not conventional, I immediately infer here that this author, Emerson, appreciates originality, not tradition or chewed up, tested, and approved pieces of art or artists or writers and that kind of thing. He likes originality. And he goes on and says, the soul always hears an admonition in such lines. He is also, if I were to comment on that, he's also the kind of person who is able to feel compelled to change based on quality thoughts in writing. An admonition is something that says, hey, get your life right, or hey, change your thinking in this way. And so if he sees something original and admirable in that original writing or idea, he sees it as an automatic opportunity to feel admonished, to change his behavior or his ways in a way that makes him better or stronger or more educated. Next, it says, analyze the use of language to identify positive and negative connotation and determine a tone or tones for parts of the text. So, at this point, I've only really touched on some of the things that I have done. Obviously, I just said that there are a lot of different comments that I make here. Some are reactions to the text, where I get to digest it and make application, and I think about it. Some of them are different ways of conveying the text. For example, where he says that Moses, Plato, Milton is the highest merit we ascribe to Moses, Plato, and Milton is that they set at naught, or in other words, made useless or vain books and traditions, and spoke not what men, but what they thought. A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within. That obviously was something I thought was very important. He uses a figurative expression to convey this really powerful impulse that people should pay attention to, according to Emerson. Don't ignore a thought that flashes from within your mind. Don't ignore your own ideas only to feel like you have to accept the people's ideas of those around you. So I made a comment here about personal thought versus books, traditions, other people's thoughts, bards and sages. Isn't that kind of counterintuitive? In other words, it goes against what normally we think is right, that my own personal thoughts trump or are of greater priority than the books and traditions and other people and bards and sages and the smart folks around us, or the populace around us, or the majority of people around us. Are my thoughts really better than everybody else's thoughts, even the smartest of folks in society? According to Emerson, he says yes. He says your thoughts And their thoughts are equally important, but to oneself. My thoughts are not someone else's thoughts, only unless they too think them on their own. In other words, you have to take care of yourself. You have to feel empowered, not by someone else's impulses, but by your own. All right. Well, then once I have analyzed the use of language, once I've gotten a firmer grasp of what the text is saying at this point, then I'm going to analyze the use of imagery or language to identify positive and negative connotation. Notice at this point, I've really not conclusively gotten to a claim, but I think we're getting a lot closer. Basically, when we're looking for repetition or repeated language, I began to highlight. At this point, I thought, well, if I'm going to analyze for claim, I better really distinguish what I'm thinking could be related to the claim. And so I distinguish it with yellow in this document. So you'll see, to believe your own thought, to believe what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men. At this point, that's what I think conveys all of these ideas. How so? Well, thought is repeated a lot, right? Is it in this sentence? Yeah. What about the idea of pay more attention to yourself than others' thoughts? Is that part of this sentence? Well, yes. It says to believe what's true for you in your private heart is true for all men. So obviously, this idea he considers genius must be a pretty significant one, and quite possibly the claim itself. It also could be maybe related to the claim, and there might be a more direct place where he discusses it. So, as far as development is concerned, he begins with a poem. Now, that's an awfully illustrative, descriptive, fanciful way, a very poetic, flowery way to introduce the concepts of his work. This is not to be ignored. Man is his own star. Oh, there's a lot of stars in the sky, right? But man himself, individually, is significant apart from all other stars. And that honest and the soul that can render an honest and perfect man commands all light, all influence, all fate. So these are going to be very similar ideas to what he is conveying, except for these are more figurative. And he wants you to be thinking. Really, I mean, the very first thing he does is give you essentially lines of a play, very poetic. Why wouldn't he just come out and be very straightforward? Because he is a man all about originality, and because originality doesn't come just by repeating something somebody had told him, but instead allowing the mind to work for itself. When you read poetry, do you think you read it the exact same way as the person next to you, or a person in your class, or another person in your school, or any person on this planet for that matter? Are there ideas that you think probably come to your mind that are exclusive to your mind because of your own education and your own experiences, as opposed to the education and experiences of other people? So why begin an essay on self-reliance where it esteems valuing your own thoughts as opposed to valuing others' thoughts before your own? Why start with a poem? Because poetry exudes personal reflection, creativity, uniqueness, and responsiveness. And that's the way we react. Everyone has his or her own thoughts to poetry. And it's so awful, really it is, when the very first thing we want to do is, oh, what does this mean? Tell me what this says. And we go to Spark Notes or something like that just to tell us what someone else thinks a poem is saying. They're no different, honestly, than others. They might have some better understanding of maybe the author's intent or the poet's intent or maybe a word's meaning or something. But when it comes to genuine interpretation of poetry, a poem is better felt than analyzed for explicit, concrete meaning, right? Right. All right. So now I go down in the second page and I come across what had started out as a poem and then, softens very quickly to I read the other day, a very comfortable, casual language Now he gets to a point where he's discussed, various figures of speech, a kernel of corn, and the um, and the various what was it, stars on the first page, but the various ways that you could look at an individual's significance in nature as opposed to everything else's significance. He says we but half express ourselves and are ashamed of that divine idea which each of us represents. Does that correlate with this one? A divine idea, what's true in your private heart. So that's quite possible. We but half express ourselves. We don't do enough. We don't express our deepest beliefs and convictions and ideas. Is that implied in this? Well, yeah, certainly. To believe your own thought, to believe what's true for you in your private heart is true for all men. That is genius. Now to believe is different than to express, right? So these two things are connected, but how is he building them? If these are connected to the real root claim, which they both are, then how is he building these? He starts with the idea of believing your own thought, and then he continues with the idea of expressing that thought. Isn't it true that before you can express a thought, you have to have it in your mind? And before you would express a thought, not only would you have it in your mind, but you also would place value in it. You would believe it and then express it, right? And so that's the second time he repeats a very similar statement as he's continuing to develop this idea of trusting oneself. And then he begins this third paragraph very explicitly. Now, these other two instances, they were a little bit more verbose. They were a little bit wordier. But in this one, trust thyself. That simple, independent clause. And then he has a colon, and it says, every heart vibrates to that iron string. What iron string? The iron string is that motto, that statement, that belief statement, trust thyself. So the iron string is that worthy, reliable message of trusting yourself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. All right, so I've analyzed claim. I've located the claim. And if I am right in locating that claim based on all of my notes that I've taken so far, and I've thought through what each paragraph means, I've thought through some of my applications. Here I made an application. A man is relieved and gay when he has put his heart into his work and done his best. I said, so true. Happiness and heartfelt hard work. That's true, isn't it? Personal thought. This is his personal thought. Personal thought goes with personal effort, and it is true, isn't it? Like, you don't get any real true fulfillment or joy from copying someone else's work and submitting that in school. Real joy comes from doing it yourself, and you're like the old red hen that didn't that made sure that the wheat was that the seed was sown and that the seed was watered and that it was eventually harvested, and then it was made into bread. All the different parts work together. And so the idea is, all of that hard work, you reap the consequences of that, right? As opposed to you take the easy way out. No, not so. That's not so rewarding, not so satisfying. All right. And so he goes on and discusses the oracles. What pretty oracles nature yields us on this text in the face and behavior of children, babes, and even brutes. Isn't it true that almost every person becomes very innocent when they look into the eyes of a baby, right? We make silly faces, we make silly sounds, we do silly things that, in a different room to a room of adults, we would be less willing to do because we would be embarrassed. We're worried about what other people think. We're worried about the norms and traditions of society. You just don't act that way. But nature really comes out when you're in front of that baby. And so that's what he's beginning to do at this point. He begins to turn from having made his claim and discuss the meaning of that in pretty good detail about how when you consider what is in your heart or in your spirit, the thoughts of oneself, when you consider how that allows you to transcend everyone else, it allows you to be above the norms and traditions, it allows you to be above what institutions and governments and groups of people tell you to believe. When you think for yourself, you're above all of that, and that is a transcendent destiny. But he says here that, basically, um, if only more people were like babies and children and brutes. Now, a brute, by definition, is a savage and savagely violent person. Why would he value or esteem a brute right next to a child or a baby? And the answer to that is that he is saying, despite whatever badness you want to credit to that person, these are people who do not care what anybody thinks. They're going to be themselves. They're going to be that brutish, beastly person no matter what. What a jerk. What a bully. But he's saying, even though we react to this and would possibly argue with Emerson, he's saying that's a good thing. At least these people aren't worried about the people around them judging them or holding them down or keeping them from being who they really are. That's an interesting thing to say. But it is him being somewhat consistent. It also may be that he's trying to be clever and witty and seem more deep in his thinking than he would have otherwise been if he had just said children and babes. So at this point, I continued to read, and let's just go back. So identify figurative language. So in this, you'll notice I've analyzed for some figurative language. As figures of speech, the iron string metaphor, flashes of light, kernel of nourishing corn, guides, redeemers, benefactors, joint stock company, like you've heard about the Dow Jones and the NASDAQ, stocks recently on Wall Street plunging because of the coronavirus outbreak and all of the current health concerns and economic concerns, because however probably like 80% of our workforce is stuck at home right now and all of that. That's a scary thing, but a joint stock company, he uses that as a metaphor and says, just like groups of people, just like individuals who contribute or invest in a company, invest in stock in a company, all that allows them to do is to agree on decisions to secure bread for each stakeholder. In other words, for you and all the other people who invest. But in that collective aim, society sacrifices the liberty and culture of the eater, he says. In other words, every individual's uniquenesses are sacrificed for the sake of the way that people who purchase stocks want products to be, and how their products can influence the society around them. We're all conforming. And his problem is we shouldn't be. Emerson says we shouldn't be. We need to get away from the norms of society that force us to feel and be so conformed and begin to think much more freely for ourselves. All right, well, let's go back down to the bottom of this document, and it says, once I've identified figurative language and I've seen how that really fits into the development of the claim, or usually it's going to be to illustrate the claim, isn't it? Or illustrate, support examples of the claim to help the reader be more familiar with, and we can relate. A reader can relate to figurative language well. It's a lot more. Now, the purpose of the figurative language is so that it's easier to grasp and less straightforward. We have that side of us that wishes to be entertained, that wishes to have examples that are catchy and memorable, and that's what figurative language does, that flash of light, instead of it just being a thought. It is something that's like a spark, those synapses of the brain firing off, those electrical impulses, and it's a recognition that occurs, and it's memorable with the figure of speech. So and then you compare paragraphs and identify ways one paragraph builds on one before it, um, and and this happens in this text. Like I said, it starts with this very figurative poem, then it continues with this very soft personal tone I read the other day, and it continues to basically a message of urgency and zeal. It's a tone of conviction. It's a convicting tone, something where we realize and we half express. It's very much like go do this, aspirational, get it done now, trust thyself. So it's urgent, but yet it's also sensical and doable. All right, then he goes on and says, let's see, identify specific places where the writer seems to be trying to be more edgy, thought-provoking, or impactful. And here, by the way, is where I think, at this point you can clearly say I've just about got the claim. It says an overarching claim is basically a thesis. So you'll find, like I said, repeating ideas like these that are highlighted yellow will apply to that. And let's see. At that point, analyze the reasoning of the writer. Does he or she rely more on logos, pathos, or ethos? And this gets us more toward the angle of, this gets us more toward the angle of, well, what was it? Yeah, the purpose and strength of reasoning, all right? Strength of reasoning. So logos, ethos, pathos, and asking myself, are there any weaknesses of this text? And so on. So this is a quick wrap up to, and basically an overview, but he gets to this point where he transitions to using babies, particularly boys. He doesn't go with the brute thing for very long. You'll notice that was super fast. He probably doesn't want to rely on that much. In fact, I see a little bit of a motive here. Yes, he's going to say even brutes. He's like giving that really gotcha, powerful, making you think, wait a second, you mean, somebody can kill someone else because he's just meatheadish and reckless, and that person is somebody I should admire and look up to. And he doesn't let you dwell on that for very long, because he basically then goes on and says, let's think about babies for a while. Children and babies. Infancy conforms to nobody, all conform to it. And he goes on and says, bashful or bold, then he will know how to make us seniors very unnecessary. I think when Emerson wrote this, he's only about 40 years old, upper 30s, low 40s. He's not that old, but he obviously is saying he's much older than an adolescent. And this is an interesting place where the tone of this text all of a sudden takes this really strong turn toward the youth. It makes me think of modern day politics, and how liberals, conservatives, both groups sort of jockey in position to try to appeal to the younger voters as much as they can. And generally speaking, people become more conservative as they grow older and are more liberal as they're in younger years. And there are a variety of reasons for that, which I will not go into. However, here it seems like that's what he's appealing to. Who's going to shake the norms of society that have been handed down for years and years and years? The older folks? No. It's going to be the younger folks. So if Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller are going to influence anybody within modern American culture at this time, it's going to be the young folks. They're the ones who are going to embrace this the most, just like the hippies of the 1960s, and just like the modern generation today. If you were to shake off the traditions and norms of society, that's going to be expected among your your teenagers, but more particularly your college age young adults who are going off away from home, experimenting with life outside the home, and beginning to establish values or reestablish the same values they've had, but for more personal and well thought out, determined reasons. All right. So, anywho, what this is doing at this point is he's using children. So as the development continues, the tone seemed to have that sort of youthful zeal, sort of conviction centered, provocative, thoughtful, urgent, um, think about this sort of tone. But now definitely uh, it reaches a point where it's very clear, because he starts referencing young people, that that's the audience that he is targeting. Which leads us finally to this last page, or this last paragraph in this section, and that in the section which I analyzed, and that is the one where, in my opinion, he switches to a sort of tone that is um, uh, brazen. He is, what did I call it in my piece over here? Um, let's see. I liked my word choice. It had been fresh, provocative, energetic, but now in this last one, I believe he changes from subversive to callous. Now, subversive is he's trying to get people to shake government, to shake norms, to shake religious groups, to shake off whatever it is that they had been conformed to, and to freely think for themselves is what he is suggesting. So I think it's a very subversive tone to a very callous one. Now, subversive, basically saying, well, he gives this example of how he as a minister in training, was taught by an advisor once the old doctrines of the church, and basically Emerson interrupted the guy and said, "Hey, old preacher, what do I have to do with any of this tradition stuff that you're trying to teach me?" And then he was reprimanded, reproved somewhat by this older man, and the end outcome of this was, to the man, Emerson said, "They do not seem to me as such, but if I am the devil's child, I will live then from the devil." In other words, I'm going to go by my personal convictions because I value them as divine. I value them as sacred. My inner thoughts are godlike in themselves, and so are everyone else's thoughts. So, he says, no law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. All right. And at that point, he goes, as I had said, he goes from this sort of subversive tone to very callous. And the callous part of it is, that there are people who are bigots, and they on one hand, say abolition, abolition, let's free the slaves down in Barbados, but then they come back home, and the year of this is like the early 1840s. When this has happened in Barbados, the slaves were emancipated in 1834, and so obviously now we've still got slavery in the southern states until our Civil War, and so he's pointing out the hypocrisy and the bigotry of people who, on one hand, would tout freedom of those slaves in Barbados, but come back home and be indifferent and careless, and pull the wool over their eyes for any slavery that's going on in the States. And he does the same thing for the poor, and he basically says, hey, I don't have to worry about the poor. I only belong to the ones that I feel affinity to belong to. In other words, I choose who I want to care for, and I don't feel guilty for not caring for the others. And then he has a problem with relief society. So it's a very callous person that you get. And structurally speaking, look how long this paragraph is. When you want to go on a rant, how long is it? Do you divide it up much? Are rants long-winded and drawn out? Or are they short and concise? Definitely long-winded, right? So it began on this page and takes up the entire next page. That's a rant. What tone do rants usually have? Definitely they have the tone of sarcasm and irony and um, arrogance at times, and in this case, also subversiveness and callousness. All right. Well, this was an analysis of the text. It was also my opportunity to try to demonstrate my thought processes. You want to dig deeply in the text that you're going to be doing when you are selecting one of the texts from the unit. So make sure that you check out those. They are going to be located in the Just Tell Me What to Do part of this unit. You will find that here. And it says you can choose friendship, heroism, gifts, civil disobedience excerpt, a short essay on critics, or a review of Emerson's essays. You can also choose from Self-Reliance. If you've really liked this, you can choose a different chunk of pages that we have not discussed as a class. And that's your overview of what types of work goes into the analysis prior to you being able to produce an analysis of a claim. And remember, this document with all these different steps can be helpful in you identifying your claim as you annotate, and then to break down that analysis into something that you can make into digestible segments to pass on as a product for your assignment this week. Good luck.